separates us from the animals in a pretty profound sense, and that's a very writer thing to say, right? But scientists will say, well, it's math, right? It's whatever, right? But I think it's storytelling, and I think the essential function of storytelling is pedagogical, right? I think that you tell a story to communicate a point, right? Now that when I say pedagogical, I don't necessarily mean in like an educational sense, although that's certainly the point of some stories. But I think that characters go through a story, right? Whether that's characters in a novel or characters in an anecdote, right? Like you have a sort of a rhetorical crea, right? You tell a story about like a hypothetical person doing whatever, so that you don't have to, right? They experience something, even hypothetically, so that you don't have to, right? And now that might be purely for entertainment, right? The goal of the story might be for you to experience an emotion. That's still a kind of education in sort of the broadest sense of the term. So it can just be to entertain, but it can also be to instruct, whether that is, to impart like a piece of actual, like concrete knowledge, scientific knowledge, or philosophical knowledge, or whatever, right? It might be to engender an emotional experience. I was thinking about like Orwell's 1984 specifically, right? Which is totally an essay disguised as a novel, right? It is, it is deeply a deeply pedagogical story. But it's more instructive for us to get Orwell's point through Winston's experiences, through Julia's experiences, and through O'Brien, right? Than it is for him to just simply expound his point. Now, I'm not saying that like every novel is someone sitting there, basically with a piece of chalk, like trying to teach you a lesson, right? But like I said, the lesson can take different forms. And I think the basic, and I think that once, if I'm right, I think then the question of how narrative works is a sort of secondary question about answering whatever the author's goal is with the story, right? This is sort of my basis for how I think about literary criticism generally, is as a means of evaluating whether or not the author was successful in communicating their vision. Right? There are some books I think that are successful despite the author's intent, or some way, or in some way at right angles with the author's intent, whereas some are directly on message, and the author knows exactly what he or she is doing at all times. And so I think I'm getting away from the point, but I think that it is essentially this pedagogical sort of exercise, in sort of an abstract kind of way.
All right. So AP, do you want to repeat some of what you said earlier and jump in on what Christopher said there? Because I pressed the live button a little bit late, which is why we're getting some comments in there. So I kind of cut you off a little bit. Do you want to add anything to that or extrapolate?
Well, to be honest, what did I say? It's but Christopher made like absolutely brilliant points there, because narrative is a form of communication, and behind communication is obviously the transmission of information and ideas and concepts across from one person or one position to another. So narrative is a structured form of doing that. And the point I'd made was, if you're going to classify a general concept of what narrative is, it's usually, in most general terms, a sequence of narrative events, so things that happen that are causally linked. But then again, that's both inadequate to describe what it is that we're talking about, because narrative is so broad. So you can think of, Christopher pointed out there, like 1984, clear ideological and political things being investigated. And then you can think of something that is not trying to do that, but is simply whimsy, or is for entertainment purposes. Or, we talk about the chewing gum for the brain, that, there's nothing of substance to there, but it's a lot of fluff, but it's entertaining fluff. They're all different forms of narrative. And then we start getting into an evaluation of, well, what is great narrative? What is great literature? What is great art? And we're applying a whole set of criteria that don't necessarily apply to the concept as a whole. But ultimately, I think communication is key in all of this. And it's, and we can get into a discussion of death of the author and authorial intent, because I'm of the camp that authorial intent is important. It's not always knowable. It is not always definitive in what's going on. But what can be discerned from the text and picking apart and trying to make these arguments, that can add to our understanding of what's on the page. It's not that what the author intended overrides all perspectives. That's ridiculous, because there's two people in this communication, the author and the narratee, the audience. And that second person's views have to be taken into account, because it's a balance between the two positions. So communication and the transmission of information and concepts, or something that's just wildly entertaining, that is at the heart of what a lot of narrative is. And we use it for very different forms and formats and in different media. But I think that those are general aspects that go around this, because every time we think of a specific example, and you can think of 1984 and go, right, we're going to talk about what 1984 is doing. But that is radically different in a lot of circumstances to say Michael Bay's Transformers.
Yeah.
But Michael Bay's Transformers is still narrative. It's still doing a whole load of things, but it is radically different in so many different respects. Or then we could think of, propaganda films. You go, well, there's a very clear thing happening in propaganda. But then we think about how news, sometimes when we read a news story, even the word selection on the page, we can see the influence of narrativization and how certain positions are creeping in the framing of something. So narrative and the study of literature and narrative and all of this, the reason I love it so much is it impacts almost every facet of our lives and our perception of the world around us.
Yeah. So maybe one of the difficult things when you're writing, I've found, is to get the ratios right, to balance everything out. Dialogue and inner reflection and world building and exposition and what Ursula Le Guin called stress and release, action and tension and suspense, and just, how to balance all of those things out. And so I'll ask you, Christopher, is that something that you think about when you're writing, or does it just come naturally? Do you just have an intuitive sense of what the shape of a story should be and sort of how to tune the audio equalizer? Or is it something that you get through literary osmosis from a lifetime of reading books? How exactly do you find that balance?
This is maybe an unsatisfying answer, but it isn't something I think about very much. The one way, like, because you're talking like a compositional sense, like how like actively are you thinking about keeping, all these things, in balance as you're going, right? As opposed to like in the planning stage. The only real thing I do, and this is like a really, this is maybe a silly answer, is I look at how long my paragraphs are, and are they starting in the same way, over and over and over again. So I'm writing in first person. If every paragraph on the page starts with I, it is about time for me to do something differently, right? If it's all dialogue, something needs to change, unless I'm like very deliberately doing like some stichomythia, right? Like back and forth stuff, right? You don't want to be too repetitive structurally, in like a rhetorical sense, on the page, right? So if all your paragraphs are about the same, and you're describing something, you've probably done it enough. And it's like a physical thing. You can see it when it's all on the page. And readers you don't want to lull them to sleep, and repetition is relaxing, right? Now, sometimes you want that, right? There are exceptions, right? This isn't, a one size fits all situation. But if you're trying to keep all these factors in balance at all times, and I usually just think about this in terms of the I thing, and in terms of like dialogue versus not dialogue. This is how you get out of the white room syndrome that a lot of early writers fall into, where they're so invested in the conversation as conversation, they start writing a film script, and they forget that Christopher Nolan is not coming along to put the mise en scène. They'll just write dialogue back and forth. Jim said, Steve said, Jim said, Steve said. And you can actually see physically when you've done this, because the paragraphs are short, they're staccato, they're all, starting with quotation marks. And so you can correct for it that way. And I find that if you just do that, and you look at the actual words on the page, that you can avoid this trap pretty much completely. At least that has been my experience. Because then, you in seeing this, you realize, oh, I haven't described the room they're in half a page. Even one sentence of detail about that room will help concretize the scene, right? Whether that's a smell or a color or the position of the characters changing in some way. You can fall into like second order traps after that. Like maybe the characters are nodding too much or they're like drumming their fingers on the table too much. But that's like a, that's the next level problem, right? At least they're not in the construct from the Matrix anymore, right? They're not just floating in space. Yeah, so that's become something I don't really think about very much beyond this. So.
What do you look for when you're editing with respect to what Christopher said in the question I asked AP, and how do you think about this question when you're giving advice to writers who are using you to help them get published and help them better understand their work?
Again, every project, every writer, every author is individual, and it's bizarre because you can say, every scene or every other chapter, this author opens up and it's dialogue. Just as Christopher was pointing out, and it's talking heads, these voiceless forms in a white void, and you go, oh well, there's no scene, and then you'll sort of go, but every other chapter opens up with a page and a half of intricate description of this scene, and I'm going, can you please stop describing the landscape? It's not for a lot of editing. It's about trying to find the balance within the manuscript in front of you. So there can be an enthralling dialogue sequence. And it's a brilliant backwards and forwards. And you go, right, this is great, but it's 4.5 pages of just dialogue. If you start adding in, just as Christopher said, like a little description that's physical, a little bit of physical action, start building it out. And what you find is that physical space on the page, the manipulation of white space, you are adding in different types of writing. There's the description of the scene or the setting. There's physical action, there's emotive responses, little descriptions like that break up the dialogue. And you can make an analogy to a lot of TV shows. So you can imagine someone gets up and they're giving an impassioned speech in front of a crowd. So if you're thinking of how this would be written out, it's this giant monologue. But of course, that's not how it's done. There's the first part of the monologue, and then it cuts to a close-up of someone in the audience. And then it cuts back to a close-up of their face, and then it's a wide angle shot. And there's this constant movement backwards and forwards to stimulate visual interest, because otherwise it's just someone standing there talking. And in order to replicate that in literature, which is obviously a different medium, it has similarities and analogies, but it has to function differently because it's a different medium. And that's where you start thinking about the different elements of the different types of writing that are going in. Johnny Wirtz once said to me that dialogue is essentially something that stops action. That as soon as you have dialogue, that you've arrested the action of the scene. So how do you balance that out? Well, you start adding moments of action into not necessarily the dialogue tags, but incorporating the dialogue into action. The little descriptions of the room, have them move around the room. Don't have them static. Any high schooler who has studied drama finds out that one of the important things about staging a play, the movement of people on stage. It's not just people standing there reciting their lines. It's about the movement of these people, because that, again, stimulates interest. And so when you're editing, quite often you're looking for particular tics or patterns that an author has either knowingly or unknowingly created. And then you're testing it against what you know about what an audience is expecting, what is going to be an effective form of communicating this. And you then work with the author to say, you have this whole sequence. This is great stuff. If you do it this way, you can emphasize X. If you do it that way, you're going to emphasize Y. So thinking about what you're trying to communicate in this sequence, which way would you prefer to go? And you work with an author to help them communicate what it is, rather than going, no, every chapter should start with a half paragraph of description and then mention your main character's point of view by name, and then have in the next thing a line of dialogue. It's not a checklist. And that's where, you sort of, I think, see a lot of beginning writers trying to follow advice very rigidly and going, well, I've been told I must open a chapter this way. Well, not every chapter, and not necessarily your chapters. Think of your story, what you're trying to communicate. And you're the author, you're the artist, you're the one telling the story. So the management of white space, the shape of a paragraph, the length of sentences, short, sharp sentences in a row pick up the perception of pace in a reader because they're reading these staccato lines. And then suddenly you have a long 5-clause sentence, and that reader has slowed all the way down, and maybe they've gotten to the end of that sentence and they've gone back and reread it to make sure that they got everything. You can manipulate the reader interaction with the text. And having dialogue, because dialogue occupies less space on a page, they're going to move through that page faster. So that's one of the ways that you can control pace through the chapter. All of these different elements, which are almost completely separate in one sense from what is actually happening. And it's where you have the marrying of what is happening, matching how it is being told, that we get some of the best sequences in storytelling, where there's consideration of all of these different facets and they come together and support one another. And, that's exciting for me as a narrative nerd.
Yeah, it's interesting what you said, AP, and I want to turn this to you, Christopher, because I was actually thinking when both of you guys were talking about Gnosticism versus materialism and how a writer can get too caught up in, say, describing in exposition, in describing the physical people and how they're moving and how they're acting, or the physical landscape. Whereas my wife actually criticized me a number of times for she's called me a brain in a vat. She says your characters are just all inner subjectivity and they're all thinking, and it's so much of the character thinking about their life, and then there's not enough, it's not grounded enough, and that sort of thing. I'm wondering where you fall on that spectrum and that sort of thing, because I had an experience the other day. I was reading Storm of Swords, and I realized I had gotten through probably, and this is speaking of AP's points on dialogue, I had gotten through like 5 chapters in a row. And I said to myself, so much is happening in this book. It's incredible. And then I realized when I closed the book, actually, everyone was just talking the whole time. And not a lot was actually happening. And so that means that George R. R. Martin is a unique writer in the sense that he's able to have just characters talking in a smoky back room. But you feel like so much has happened and there's been all this action. And really, it's just, Machiavellian connivers speaking in some over some table, and it's been happening for 4 straight chapters. Where do you fall on that spectrum, and what advice would you give to writers who are asking similar questions about finding that balance?
Yeah, I think in Martin's case that might be an artifact of his TV writing, right? Because so much of what you are what you are writing when you're writing a script is the dialogue, right? Because all the other channels are sort of in the hands of other people to an extent. Now you have to give the director a bit of a framework, but this goes back to what AP was saying about medium, right? And the thing about prose literature that's sort of different from making a comic book or a movie or a television show or a video game or really anything else is that all those channels are kind of in the hands of one person. Right now you have an editor, but you are playing actually every instrument that's available to you. When I did one Marvel Comics story, right? It was like a 10-page little short, right? But I had to learn how to write comic books for this. And the thing that really, there are a lot of things that are that seemed obvious, right, in retrospect, but I just never thought about. You can't do more than one thing in a panel, right? Because it's a static image. There are limitations of the medium, but there was also a great sense of relief when I realized that most of what I was writing in the script, no one was ever going to see, right? Because it was up to the artist to sort of make that work. So I think that if you're writing, a script generally, that you tend then to think mostly about how the dialogue works and feels and flows and sounds, because all that other stuff is, the director's job, the set director's job, right? The people who are building whatever, and the composer's job, right? Whatever. Now, when you're writing prose, it's all on you, right? So I think in George Martin's case, his ability to do that, or his tendency to do that, depending on your preference, is maybe an artifact of that whole part of his career, but which is interesting because it is amazing how he can do so much with like actually just an old lady sitting at a table, right? But as far as the Gnosticism thing goes, one, I just want to say, like, do we ever get through a conversation without you saying the word Gnosticism, Jordan? I don't think we ever.
No, we don't. But at the same time, I was thinking about how I'm going to use a Catholic term here. You kind of want your fiction to be hylomorphic.
I knew this is where you were going, right? Well, see, here's the thing: is that Aristotle is right, and we are not ghosts piloting meat robots. We are actually like embodied persons, right, with an interior life, and those things are completely integrated, body and soul, and are not really intelligible if you try to separate them. And narrative does reflect this. This is something I hadn't thought about exactly until you spelled it out just now. But since you were leading me, I'll take the bait. I think that's right, because I think you can fall into either one of those traps. I think you can only describe exterior action and all this stuff, but there is this additional sort of fourth dimension, right, of interior space that needs to be in prose to a certain degree. Now, like that, the degree to which you need to have that interior life has sort of varied, over the course of literature, right? You read older stuff, and maybe there's more or less of it depending on the period you're talking about, right? Or depending on the medium too. I'm always amazed reading Robert E. Howard at how much happens in a Conan story. Way more happens in a Conan short story than happens in most modern novels, in terms of action. It's really, really amazing. Actually, in 10,000 words, he can do more than even I can with 300,000 words. In some cases, that might be a slight exaggeration, but the nature of the writing is different structurally. In part because he isn't spending a lot of time in Conan's head. But I don't know that necessarily would make him a materialist. I think that you can address. I don't think that not exploring the interior dimension necessarily makes a writer materialistic, and if only exploring the interior dimension makes you a Gnostic. But because I think there's room for how you go about that. But I think as a heuristic, I think that's an interesting sort of premise. And I personally think that you should have a bit of both. I think that modern readers especially like that interior exploration. I think that's very in at the moment. I think that's one of the reasons why my own stuff has done as well as it has been doing, because it is very about like one person's sort of emotional and spiritual journey, right? But in the context of being a space Roman and fighting robots and monsters and all that stuff, right? Because you got it, right? But there's with the exception maybe of Frodo, there's not a lot of interiority in Tolkien, really, right? But that doesn't mean it's not there. He gets criticized for having pretty flat characters, but I don't think that means they're not interesting. I think that the expectations of modern readers are often mismatched to what the book is. Aragorn is deeply complicated and multifaceted, but he doesn't have growth. He doesn't need to grow. He did it all already, right? And so the fact that we don't have to explore his internal psyche might disappoint modern readers, but it's not like it's not accounted for. It's not like it wasn't thought about. So there are different approaches to how you can turn those dials, and as long as you can find a way to make anything work, there really are very few hard and fast rules for like how those dials need to be set. People tend not to like second person, but like even there you can like make it work under certain circumstances and in certain dosages. But but there are conventions that people expect, right? And you can only betray or abuse your audience so far. They like it a little bit, I found, but you can't just completely defeat their expectation of what a story looks like, because then they won't read it because they don't have to.
That's right. Some Okie dude, Britain. Yes. I get accused of too much navel gazing, but the funny thing about that is that I was weaned on Kierkegaard and these 20th century American suburban fiction writers like John Updike and Richard Ford. Richard Ford's his Frank Bascom quadrilogy is all about a Haddam, New Jersey sports writer turned realtor who lives the most boring life you can possibly imagine, but his interior life is incredibly rich. And that's kind of how I write. And then people tell me that you really shouldn't do that, or you can't do that in fantasy. So that kind of brings me to the next question I wanted to ask you, which is how all of this stuff we've been talking about applies to fantasy or speculative fiction. Is fantasy, or in Christopher's case, sci-fi, is that kind of storytelling different? Is the approach different? I know there are in some ways more demands on the writer, or maybe it's just me, because right now I'm putting the finishing touches on my first fantasy novel right now, and so I'm no pro like Christopher, but there's a lot more that a fantasy writer has to introduce the reader to. You know, if I'm writing a work of literary fiction about academics in the 1980s who live in Brooklyn and their lives and their entanglements, or I don't know, if I'm writing a police procedural thriller novel set in Chicago in the present day, I don't have to do very much world building. Everyone knows a little bit, or in some cases a lot of it, about Chicago and what it's like and what makes it unique. So in a present day Chicago novel, I don't have to really introduce my readers to the world or its rules or its norms or the cultural context as much as I would have to if I'm writing fantasy. So I guess there's just more that can threaten to get in the way, I guess, of a clear-cut, swiftly moving, captivating plot when it comes to speculative fiction. I'm sure the best writers are, what they probably do is weave all of that together in a way that's satisfying and smooth. What was John W. Campbell's maxim was to make the marvelous seem mundane, and the mundane will seem marvelous, right? So it's like, okay, the book starts and my anti-hero wakes up with a massive hangover. So the first thing he does is he takes his stimmies, and then it's time to shower. So he gets under the cleansing ray and he puts on his virtual reality goggles and clocks in for work. And he can make that all seem kind of normal and mundane. And guys like Heinlein and Philip K. Dick were very good at this. But anyways, does any of that resonate? Is that kind of, how do you see that question, AP? Is that what you see the best writers doing? Yeah.
Well, how you approach this and how you formulate it, I get your point, but I come from a very different position on this. If you're writing a book set in 1980s Chicago, you have to do all the same world building that someone writing a book in a science fictional universe has to do. I'm not from 1980s Chicago. I have no idea what 1980s Chicago is. How are you going to evoke that on the page? If you watch The Untouchables, period piece, that has to be recreated because your reader doesn't know that world. World building has become this sort of term that gets labeled in science fiction and fantasy for the creation of a secondary world. But world building in narrative is about creating the concrete ground that your characters are standing on, the landscape they walk in, and how you communicate that to a reader. So whether your character is wandering through Elfland or wandering through Belize, a jungle in Belize, you still have to evoke that. You still have to create that world, that story world for your reader. And you can't rely on the fact, oh, well, everyone knows what Chicago is. I'm sorry, well, no, they don't. Even just if you narrow it down to people in the English-speaking world, you know, you can take that American centrism and go, oh, well, everyone knows what Chicago is. I grew up in Belfast. If I took the attitude, oh, well, everyone knows what Belfast is, you'd go, well, why would I? I didn't grow up there. But when it comes to things that we know instinctively, and we sort of have that, oh, yeah, but everyone knows that. No, they don't. People haven't visited London. People haven't visited New York. People haven't visited these places. They don't know the history of Chicago. And, you know, you can write a very successful series set in Chicago with a wizard PI without having been there until, you know, much later on in your writing career, because it's the evocation of place. And, you know, you can pick a bunch of that stuff up from online, from research. But world building is not a separate element that is solely in science fiction and fantasy. World building is part of any sort of immersive storytelling, creating that sense of your story world, communicating it to the reader, making the characters feel that they actually live in that world. Because if you have a character who is a wizard and they've been a wizard for the last 50 years, and then someone does some magic and they're like, wow, magic, and you go, that doesn't make any sense. They're a wizard, they should understand that. if you have a character who's grown up in the hinterlands and they've never seen magic before, and magic goes off and they're like, oh, well, yeah, that was explained in chapter 3 when we had that point of view that I wasn't part of. They still have to react in a psychologically real way because that's something that we want. But all of that is part of how you communicate the verisimilitudinous nature or the authenticity of your narrative story world. Communicating it in a way that helps a reader suspend their disbelief. You want to have spaceships that can travel faster than light? Okay, you're breaking the laws of our universe as we know them. But have you thought about it? Have you integrated it? Have you thought about the majority of the major ramifications? If you've done that, it doesn't have to be in the text, but you'll find it'll actually shape how you approach talking about it. And that's what makes things feel more real, even though real is a terrible term to be applying to narrative, but it makes it feel more real. So that would be the slight quibble I would have with how you formulated that. And
it makes me feel better, AP. Actually, to be honest with you, I'd never thought about it like that, but I'm like breathing a sigh of relief. It's like, oh, this is something that is not separate. It's not something that I have to like put in a syringe and inject it into my story. It's all part of the same process. And that actually makes me feel better. How do you approach
No, I
this?
actually think we have it easier because if you're writing about Chicago in the 1980s, you run the risk of having readers who lived there. And they're going to know better than you if you didn't, right? This is true. I mean, this is still true in speculative fiction, right? If you're writing about the 12th century, if you're writing about a fantasy world that is loosely equivalent to the 12th century in some way, and it does not actually feel like the 12th century, or you've done something very silly like lit a castle with torches instead of rushlights, or something like that practical, or something a lot more sort of broad ranging, like have everybody speak like a millennial or curse like a millennial. Right, instead of like someone in the 12th century or like someone in a vaguely 12th century-esque culture, right? That will ruin immersion, right, for people who are familiar with what you're supposed to be pulling from. And so whether or not you're writing in a secondary world or not, the onus on you is to try and get these things right, because it doesn't, even in Narnia, it doesn't make sense to use giant torches inside where you're going to maybe at least cover the ceiling in soot, right? Those rules still apply, right? And nothing drives me crazier on this point than when people are like, well, it's just made up, right? It's fine. It's not, though. It's not fine. It has to make sense. There are limits. Unless we're living in a world where like no wood makes soot, you have to look at these things seriously. You can't set your you don't want to set your army on the front of the stakes, Game of Thrones. They need to be behind the stakes. I'm sorry, but the rules of medieval combat are not changed by the fact that Melisandre exists. This is the show's fault. I'm not picking on George, but it makes me very upset. But no, I think we actually have it easier. I think a lot of the pressure is off. One of the reasons that I chose to write so far in the future is that I could do basically whatever I wanted in terms of a lot of the on the ground reality. Because there are things I didn't want to have to worry about too much. Like cybersecurity. I don't know anything about that. I don't want to write about it. So I don't want to write a science fiction universe that like is too computer heavy, because then I would have to, one, do a lot of work that I don't want to do to learn stuff that I don't want to learn. But two, I would be writing a story I didn't want to write. Right. And so I think in fantasy and in science fiction, you have a lot more latitude to ignore dimensions of world building that you don't want to invest in than you would if you were writing any sort of period piece or realistic fiction necessarily. I remember I was talking to, I think it was Mike Cole and Michael Livingston at a convention. Michael Livingston is like an actual historian, right? Like he was trying to locate I think he did locate the actual site of the Battle of Crécy, right? And Mike Cole was writing a popular history book, and I can't remember who they were. He was telling me the story. They were having lunch with some other historian, and Michael Livingston said to this guy, who's like, that Mike wants to write a book about all these Greek battles, and he doesn't want to go to Greece to do it. And they're like, are you stupid? Like, you have to. Like, if you're going to write a book about, Thermopylae, you have to go to Thermopylae, right? Especially if you're writing nonfiction. So you have a responsibility to get that stuff right. So I actually think, yeah, like relax. Actually, it's easier making stuff up, or when you can make stuff up. There are parameters you have to fall within, but you can make up a magic lamp instead of using either torches or rushlights and ignore me completely. So
as long as you remember to put a ditch around a castle. The lack of ditches in front of castles drives me insane in so many fantasy. You go, it's a ditch. It doesn't have to be filled with water and alligators. It's just a ditch. That's all.
It's just got to disrupt the horses.
But I think a lot of that goes to the willing suspension of disbelief. And the thing is, you will always have readers and viewers who are not willing. And the thing is, you can't reach them. Sometimes you can maybe eventually get through to them. But if someone enters into it deliberately looking for flaws in the construction of the narrative story world, no author is so perfect with such a perfect understanding of a reality that they have created in their head that they can have covered every single aspect. There are always going to be holes and gaps and things omitted and things maybe perhaps overstressed, because every author has a unique perspective of things. But if we have a willing suspension of disbelief, we acknowledge going in, there have to be some things where we go, right, I'm going to turn my brain off. Let's give them a chance. Let's see how this develops. Okay, so that doesn't function in this world. And that is not necessarily a criticism of the story world. It's part of the story world. It may not be a bug. It might be a feature. And I think that's where sometimes, look at Pratchett's Discworld, and you have anachronisms all over the place. You have different dialects being used. You have elements being taken from all of these different stories. And then you have some very pointed social criticism, all dressed up in humor, and a world that is crazy and absurd and contradictory, and yet makes perfect sense. And you go, that kind of alchemy is once in a generation. So, hey, Pratchett was a unique mind. But in some respects, it's the exception that proves the rule, because there are certain elements going in that we need to believe in. And that willing suspension of disbelief has to be helped by the author. And sometimes that's abiding by genre conventions. Sometimes that's abiding by elements from our history, which there's no reason why our history should have any impact whatsoever on a secondary world. But if we take elements from our history that a reader may be familiar with, then that gives a foundation, a set of things to hang fantasy elements on. And so there's that constant tension between these things. And some of them are more important than others. I would maintain that ditches around castles are one of those more important things, but not everyone believes that.
Yeah, I think the basic thing is, if you do enough well, and if you do a couple things excellently, most readers will forgive you for the things you flub, right? So one way to sort of address this concern, right, is to find a couple of things that interest you, right, as a writer, and to do those extremely well. With Tolkien, it's language, right? George Martin has this criticism of Lord of the Rings where we're not talking about Gondor's tax code, which I completely don't understand. I think it's a completely silly critique of Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings is actually silly, right? They use the Gregorian calendar in what is supposed to be like 8,000 BC, right? And there's like tobacco and tomatoes, and like none of that matters actually. But that's because everything else is so convincing, right? All of the etymologies and the names and the places feel real because of all of his work on that and his emphasis on that. One of the things that doesn't get talked about a lot with Patrick Rothfuss, for example, is his attention to detail with regard to coinage, right? That's a little detail, and if readers have a little concrete thing that is really, really well thought out and fleshed out and implemented, that will concretize things around it that aren't concrete at all, actually, because their brain will fill in a lot of the other details. And this is true of things beyond world building. This is true of character motivations. This is true of plot. You can you can totally gap issues in plot as to like how someone knew to be X, Y, or Z if everything else sort of holds together. I'm not saying you should necessarily do that, but you can, under certain circumstances, gap things and not address them, right? A lot of new writers get sort of this kind of paralysis because they think they need to cover everything, and they feel like Paul Atreides locked in by his vision, unable to move, right? And so they don't write anything because they're like, whoa, actually, I can't write this book yet because I haven't figured out, what the denominations of coinage were in a country that I'm never going to visit in these books, right? And that's crazy. Like, don't do that, right? But readers are in a lot of ways smarter than I think a lot of writers want to give them credit for, right? They can understand stuff. You don't have to explain everything. You can trust them to fill in a lot of your gaps, and all you have to do is give them something to communicate that you've done the work, right? And that can be whatever you want it to be as the writer. I am not interested in coinage, and I'm certainly not interested in tax code. So you have to think about what that thing is for you, right? For me, it's one of the things is religion, right? I find that deeply interesting. I think that's more essential than tax codes, at least from a narrative perspective, unless your book is about taxes. But maybe it's castle construction, right? Maybe that's like super relevant to the story. And if you built a castle well enough, right, as like Tad Williams does, right, that it's really a character and in and of itself, then you can make the story, or like Mervyn Peake does, for example, right? Then the other things in the story that don't add up or close or make sense are things that readers will simply forgive because they're already there. They're already in the story. And so, I always end up saying "and so" and then stopping. But here we are.
AP, do you want to add to that?
Well, I was just, you brought up Peake there, and like Gormenghast is a perfect example of the Gormenghast itself, this stately home, this place that we're in, which is so bizarre, so straight, but is so well realized that you ignore the fact that how does the rest of the world exist? Where is this place? Like, that's not relevant to that story. Oh, and these people, this is how they act and this is how they move. The story that is being told to you is over here. And if you apply a thing of, well, where do they get their food from? How is it delivered on a daily basis? Where is this thing? And you start applying those rationales. But that's not what the story is. That's not what the story is doing. And again, then people will say, oh, well, so anything can just go. Like, no, it's not this absolutist. It's one thing or the other. Everything in moderation, a balance, finding the things that must be there. And that will be unique to that story. Finding the things that it'd be nice to have them there, but if they're missing, it's not so bad. And then finding things that are irrelevant, and we would go, well, you can trim that away. You could remove that from the text, and you lose almost nothing. And right. So is that necessary for your narrative? So it's understanding that the perception of the story world, the perception of the scene, what is being communicated. And that's why I keep coming back to, I think authorial intent is important. Not overriding, but it is really important. And having worked with authors have intent. They have things that they are trying to communicate. And the people go, oh, well, what the author intended is absolutely irrelevant. You go, if you don't have their intent, you don't have their communication. If you don't have their communication, you don't have the text. You don't have anything apart from what you individually thought. And if what you individually thought is the same value of what everyone else individually thinks, then we're just in chaos of a book means whatever I personally decide it is going to mean. It's a negotiation of these positions. It's not absolute one or the other. What a reader interprets shapes their understanding of the text. But what has been communicated had an intent behind that communication. And there can be a mismatch. It could be on what an author making a misstep, an author not communicating something effectively, or it could be on the reader side, a reader misreading, not understanding, and it's a failure on their part to decode the information or to properly understand the information. There are two parties to this, and depending on the narrative, depending on the audience, depending on the genre, depending on the medium, there are all these different considerations that come into that. If you think the Battlestar Galactica miniseries, the remake, and they had cut the edges off all of the documents to make them kind of the hexagonal shape, and they did that with the coinage. And they said, this was great for the miniseries, but then it became an absolute nightmare for the actual production, because every single document and every single shot, they had to get an intern to go round and cut all of the edges off. And it was something that was never fundamental to the story. And yet, because those things, you notice them out of the corner of your eye, it became a consistent part of the story world. It made it that little tiny bit more believable and easier to suspend your disbelief, even when other aspects of the narrative, went off the rails. When the Battlestar drops down through the atmosphere and then jumps out, because it moves so quickly, there's a giant sort of vacuum left behind of the space that it had occupied. And so all of the air rushes in and gets sucked into the gap of where it was. And you go, that lends it an element of believability that this thing could just jump out of existence. It's little things like that. Sometimes it's those tiny moments sell the fantastic, and other times they're not necessary for it. But it's all bound up together. Like, we can talk about individual aspects of narrative, but ultimately it's the entire package and how the different elements speak to one another, support one another, and the whole thing blends together.
Yeah, what you were saying, AP, reminds me of a kind of a maxim that I've had for a long time, and I don't know if it's valid or anything like that, but I've always thought that one of the things that makes a work of literature or even a film great is the attention to detail, those little tiny details that enable you, that makes the world so rich that you're able to watch it over and over and over again. You have these experiences where you read a novel and you think to yourself, well, that was fine, but I can't see myself ever reading that again. But I think one of the things that makes something like Star Wars just so eminently watchable is that I notice something new every time I watch it. And you watch it 10, 15, 20, 30 times, and you're still noticing new things. Dune is like that for me as well. I always notice something new, or a new theory pops into my head or something like that. Also, I wanted to say, AP, I loved that whole discussion about intent and things like that. What you were saying was reminding me so much of taking classes where you'd learn about like constitutional law and like the difference between public meaning constitutional originalism and intent originalism versus living constitutionalism. And I was just thinking about how similar both of those things are in interpretation and analysis, and working with the text and things like that. And Christopher, what you were saying reminded me of, there's a film, I don't know if you guys have seen, called A Knight's Tale with Heath Ledger.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's great.
And just what you were saying reminded me of that, the way in which, okay, so this is like this medieval setting, and they take all these pains to make X, Y, and Z feel really real, and then suddenly there's classic rock behind the whole thing, and then like, oh well, they're using words like ye and other vestiges of the time, but at the same time, Heath Ledger's speaking like a Gen Xer while using those dated colloquialisms or whatever. But anyways. I want to ask you, AP, when you're working with your clients, when you're editing manuscripts, one thing I've always had trouble with is how much to hold my reader's hand. And as you said, Christopher, your readers are smart; they're going to get it, and yet that still doesn't answer for me how to do that. Have you had experience with that editing, AP, where you have writers that are clearly underestimating the intelligence of their readers, or have you had the reverse? And I imagine you're going to say no, because you're a big Steven Erikson guy and he really doesn't hold your hand. So what do you think about that?
Well, for a start, I would put Christopher's the one to be asking about this, because he's the professional at doing this. I'm a sort of on the sidelines, sucking off the life force of authors, and
the critic.
You know, being a bit of a creature that just draws blood from them like a vampire or some sort of parasite.
I've never thought of critics as vampires, mostly editors.
And you know what? I'm both. So like even better, I'm a parasitical vampire. Great.
Yeah, no, so this is maybe not a workable answer for everybody, but there's a pretty common email that I get now because I wrote Kingdoms of Death, where people email me and they say, "Why do you hate me? Why did you do this to me personally?" And my response, I don't think I've ever been brave enough to respond directly to an email and just say, "I don't think about you at all," right? Because that would be rude. But like, I don't actually think about my reader when I'm writing at all, because my reader for me is me. I'm still writing something I would want to read now and would have wanted to read when I was 15 and 18 and 25. And so I explain as much as I think I would want explained or need explained. And maybe that's just maybe depending on who you ask, I have a good instinct for this, or maybe I'm bad at it. It depends on the Goodreads review. I don't know, but I don't think about the reader, and their direct experience that much. I think about the story, and since the story is in first person, I try very hard to think about how the character would tell it to his audience, but not to mine. And partly this is because I'm such a Gene Wolfe fan, right? And Gene Wolfe is much better at this than I am. At creating these first person documents that are really artifacts of their own worlds and not of ours. And if you do that, you don't really think about the 21st century person who's sitting there, because you need to be thinking about the 201st century person who's reading the story instead. And so that's not really a primary consideration for me at all, in part because I just trust the reader. And I think that so much of the conversation on this subject is about how we can communicate to the reader, as opposed to just sort of stepping back. Because to get back to the intent conversation, I hope I didn't come across as like an authorial intent supremacist at the beginning. I am an author, but like I do like obviously have an intended reading of the text, and there are goals that I'm trying to accomplish. I'm always completely fascinated and baffled by people who I think are wrong when they start talking about my books. I'm like, oh, that's very strange. Like, what did you read? But in rhetoric, right, the onus for communication is on the communicator, right? And so if somebody gets something wrong, right, that's in my mind, that's because I didn't do something 100% perfectly, right? So if they're coming away with a different interpretation, I tend to blame me. But the reality is often that like some people are just so far removed from the me that I'm imagining as my reader that in terms of their beliefs, their cultural background, whatever, that they aren't going to get to my answer. And I think that's fine, because I think that I think that while authorial intent supremacists are not correct, I think that reader intent supremacists are completely wrong. If a work of art is only what you, the beholder, deem it to be, then all art is meaningless and everything is meaningless, and we should all just give up and die, because there are no questions to answer, much less to ask. And an art is clearly, each work of art is clearly the product of its time and its place and its culture and its moment. And but that isn't all it is, right? We can't read Shakespeare as an Elizabethan now, and so there's a lot of stuff that gets lost to us, right? I remember there's a pretty famous viral video about Elizabethan pronunciation experts reciting the prologue to Romeo and Juliet, and then the first scenes in the pronunciation of the day, and there were more puns than we thought there were, because we've lost that, because we don't speak that way anymore. The pronunciation of the word hour sounded like or, which sounded like Romeo was in fact pining away, not for hours and hours, but through whores and whores, for I forget the name of the girl before Juliet.
Well, you see that with the great vowel shift too, and things like Sonnet 116, where the way that we say love now means that the poem doesn't actually rhyme anymore.
I lose my mind over this particular issue listening to hymns in church all the time. And you get this with regular songs too, where like clearly in this song, you're supposed to say again. You're not supposed to say again. Like, please, you're singing the song, do it correctly. I don't care how much they're paying you. Try it over again, right? But things get lost, right? Because we can't read necessarily historical works in their original context or in their original languages. I weep that I cannot read Dante actually. I can only read, like, I like Dante peeking in at Paradise and hearing Beatrice's name, can only actually read the English version. And that sucks for me. And, you know, so there are things that are, you know, sort of lost, but that's true of readers who are reading contemporary works. Like there are people who just like don't get I'm always baffled that like no one has caught or at least spoken to me about like all of the John Keatsisms that are like in random sentences in my books, right? They catch the Dune references, but
I
not the
catch
John
them
Keats.
all. I catch
Right.
them
Well,
all,
there's
my
you,
friend.
Jordan. You know, you are the panopticon, but you know, but it's but yeah, I don't worry so much about my readers' perspectives because I can't control them. Right. And so like they can be wrong, that's fine. You know, but you know, but I do think that the story that I think I'm writing matters, even if only in sort of a platonic sense, right? And I think the way to evaluate if I've done a good job or not is how many people sort of get what I'm trying to do, right? I think that T.S. Eliot thought that Hamlet was a failure dramatically, right? Because he didn't think that the point of Hamlet was very clear. I think if I remember the criticism correctly, something to that effect, right? But it was basically like he didn't think the play set out to do what Shakespeare was trying to accomplish, at least as far as he could tell, right? Now that's more of a forensic exercise, but with writers who say have YouTube channels and talk too much, like you can actually maybe figure out better what that intention was, right? Or if they have lots of letters, right? You can, if you're into literary studies, go and figure out what the book was trying to be and did they do a good job. Like I don't like Alan Moore, right? Because I don't like what Alan Moore is trying to say, but I like Watchmen because, you know, despite what he's trying to say, I think, you know, he actually told a pretty good story. It's not the story I think he set out to tell. Because he clearly doesn't like Rorschach, but Rorschach's like the only person who has any principles in the entire story. And he's willing to die for them, which is admirable. And yet he's confused that people like this character. It's never not baffling to me. So like he clearly didn't actually do, you know, the job he thought he was doing, but he did something cool. And now that's me as the reader, right? Applying my own interpretation to the story. But this whole sort of tug of war between reader and writer is never going to really be resolved. I just think the people who think it's just my feelings are out to lunch. So,
well, in response to like when you were saying that you don't really think about your audience,
Yeah.
I would sort of say, like from an editor's perspective, I think you do, because you're imagining an audience of people like you. So there's a whole lot of base assumptions you've built into that because you're not writing for 8-year-olds. Because if you thought, oh, I'm going to write a children's book and it's for 8-year-olds, you would tell your story so radically differently. So even when...
That's a really good point. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and like, I take your point that you're not writing for a specific audience, but when you're telling your story, it's not telling it exactly as you would in that time period, because you go, no, I'm communicating it to people like me. And that means in the language of the 21st century, using the sort of the knowledge of literature and pop culture and media and narrative that we have now, that you're building on all of those base assumptions. And so I think I understand completely your point that you're not writing to a specific audience. And I'm going, oh, how can I communicate this to my audience? But there are so many assumptions and unconscious preferences and biases that we all have. And we tend to think of ourselves as the default, as the norm. And you go, how would I tell this story to me? As if I am in some way representative of the average normal person. Well, I don't think I'm representative of normal people.
Of normal, I was about to say, yeah, no, you're completely right. But I do think I'm a particular person, right? And I think that art is like I said, I think it's a particular thing, right? You know, it has a context. But I hadn't thought about it that way. So that is a fair point. Jordan, can I respond to some Okie dude here about Rorschach briefly?
Absolutely.
Like, you are completely right. Rorschach is also an unhinged maniac, but every character in Watchmen is an unhinged maniac. It is simply a different kind of hinge. And so we can kind of control for that feature when we're talking about the characters in that book. Ozymandias is completely crazy. Dr. Manhattan is so far from his right mind at this point that it does not matter. The comedian is also completely insane. And so that is not a relevant feature, I think, of his personality in situ. But I totally agree with you. That is why Alan Moore thinks you should hate that character, but it's weird to me that he thinks you should hate that character and not Ozymandias, who commits genocide. So,
yeah, but who does? Like, it's only a little genocide.
It's
like,
it's only a little bit. It's tactical genocide.
Well, that reminds me, guys, to veer in a different direction here for a second, because I was reading Storm of Swords recently, and I realized that the way that people speak about their favorite characters in literature, or the best characters in any given book, is they tend to pick someone who is virtuous and noble, and who is, or even could be, a sexy anti-hero type of person. And I realized maybe my favorite character in the book was Lysa, who is absolutely just unbelievably unhinged. And every scene with her is awkward and cringy. And that's why I liked her, because I thought George R. R. Martin did such a good job sculpting her character and making me feel awkward in those scenes with her. And I realized that you're going to meet very few other people who are going to say Lysa Arryn is their favorite character, because of course she is incredibly grating. But that's what I thought made those scenes meaningful, right? When she's dragging Sansa in front of her and upbraiding her for something she never even did. It's so incredibly compelling. Do you think that when we say, so-and-so is the best character, should we be thinking about the character that we like most, that we'd want to have it's almost the way Americans, when you poll them about politics, they will say, well, no, I don't like that president because I don't think I could have a beer with him. And I'm thinking, who the F cares? Like, are you kidding me? Have a beer with him. I want my president to be a bureaucrat. Like, but what about you guys? If a character is deeply unlikable, if a character is maybe evil in some sense, if a character has committed a genocide, could we say that's actually a great character? No, I think that person should be locked up if that person existed in our world. But can't we say that this is a truly great character? I feel like modern people aren't so willing to do that anymore.
Well, greatness and goodness are two distinct things, right? We can separate those, and you could have a favorite character who isn't the most interesting character in a book for personal reasons, right? I don't think Gollum is my favorite Lord of the Rings character. He's pretty close, but he's like probably the most like technically impressive character in Lord of the Rings.
That's what I mean. Yeah.
And I think those are two different sort of metrics for evaluating greatness. And you can have as many metrics as you want.
Yeah.
But
because
sorry, AP, I spoke over you.
Well, it's like Darth Vader, great character. Darth Vader's a fantastic character. Wouldn't want to have a beer with him. Would rather he was locked up in space jail.
Yeah.
And even then, when we think about Darth Vader as a character, you go, is he that good a character? Is he a deep character? Well, not in the first film. He's kind of an archetype, and that he walks around being evil and arrogant and evil. Oh, great. Really deep characterization. But it fitted with the narrative that he was in. He is arresting when you're looking at him. He holds your gaze. He has that presence in the room. That illusion has been created for us. And so you go, yeah, he's a brilliant character. And you can go, he could be one of my favorite characters from A New Hope, because when we first meet Luke, Luke's really whiny. Oh, I wanted to go and try to get some power converters. Oh, cry me a river, Luke. Han Solo, oh yeah, because he's the robot. We all have personal preferences. In matters of taste and preference, the customer is always right. And the fact that people always forget the start of that sentence bugs me no end. In matters of taste and preference, the customer is always right. Not the customer is always right. There's a big difference. But so often, and it's perfectly natural and normal in everyday conversation, informal conversation, to conflate good and enjoyable. Like, we do it all the time.
Yes.
Oh, that was a great book. I really loved that book. That book was fantastic. Was it well written? Not absolute trash. But when we take that to doing reviews or speaking about books to a general public, that's, I think, where we need to be a lot more careful about the criteria that we're using and how we are expressing it. Not that your personal metric for whether a book or a character or any aspect is good is enjoyment. If that is your personal metric, then you go, yeah, that's what I'm using to rank things on Goodreads or on Amazon or wherever. You go, fine. You do realize that other people have different metrics. And as long as you take that into account, that's absolutely fine. And as long as you make it clear that your evaluation is based on this very personal, very subjective element, all the more power to you. But to present it as, I can't understand why other people don't like this. Well, that sounds like a limitation on your part. That's where I think a lot of this, and it's sometimes frustrating for me when people go, oh, this is really good. You go, you mean you really enjoyed it? Because, like, look at the opening of Goodkin Sword of Truth. No one is going to sort of go, you know what, Goodkin should have received an award for the quality of his prose and how he expressed himself. But that series is incredibly popular. So does that make it good? Well, no, it makes it popular. That's why we have a difference between the words good and popular. Popular is a thing. And we can look at that opening sequence. You go, does he do in the opening what we have a hook? Well, it's a strange alien-looking vine. For some people, that is sufficient to hook. And you go, the hook's in the opening line. We do all this. And then you have an exposition dump right in the middle, breaks the scene, changes the style of narration. Here's a whole load of backstory that you, the reader, need. There are loads of readers out there that don't care about that. They go, oh, that's great. I didn't have to think. From a technical standpoint, we look at that and go, that's really bad writing. You could have included that information. You could have integrated it into your scene without having to do this bald exposition dump. So that is bad writing. And then a Goodkin fan can say, but I really liked it. Fine. It's still bad writing.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter whether you liked it. Just because it didn't bother you doesn't make it good. Unless the criteria we are applying is, did I enjoy it? And that is not useful criterion to apply when we're trying to look at things from a more general sense or a more critical sense or a more craft perspective.
Well said. Very well said. I couldn't have said that better myself.
To do literary criticism on like an academic level, there's almost a death of the reader that needs to happen as well, which is something that people don't think about when they leave reviews. Right? It's just the book good. I liked it. And like that's great. Like I like a lot of things that are terrible. I love the Beastmaster, but it's bad. It's not good at all. But that's fine. Anyway, no, I had to get the death of the reader quip in there.
That's a perfect segue, Christopher, guys, to what I wanted to ask you. I wanted to know if you guys think it's possible to make a distinction between the kind of more breezy, accessible fantasy and sci-fi. I don't know what you would call them, beach reads or airport books. I think AP at one point called them cheeseburgers. And then on the other hand, the more dense and difficult and literary stuff that you have to kind of really study, or at least takes itself more intellectually seriously. And I'm thinking here of, as you said, Christopher, Gene Wolfe, which, by the way, to pause myself here, I would say you can appreciate Gene Wolfe at a couple of different levels. When I read Gene Wolfe with you, Christopher, and we had those conversations, I felt like it's almost like when parents have a discussion about, oh, like my kid can enjoy Sesame Street at this level, and then I can enjoy it at this level. I felt like the little kid enjoying Sesame Street when I was reading Gene Wolfe, Book of the New Sun. And then I would listen to Alzabo Soup, or I would just listen to you talk, Christopher, and then it would be like that higher level understanding. So I know, AP, these are the guys that you like to review. I'm thinking here of Guy Gabriel Kay, Ursula Le Guin, Stephen Erickson, R. Scott Baker, folks like that. I'm wondering what place the more literary stuff has in the genre these days. Do people have the patience for it? Is there a place in the genre for the Gene Wolfes of the future? Or are we kind of seeing the Marvelization of fantasy and sci-fi? I know almost for certain that you guys are going to say that insofar as we can make these kinds of distinctions, that there's room for both cheeseburgers and, truffles with caviar. And I agree with that. But as an aspiring author, I always find myself thinking when I'm reading one of your books, Christopher, how does Christopher see himself as an author? Because you're someone who really seems to straddle that line between cheeseburgers and filet mignon. And I'm wondering, Christopher, if that's conscious. What say you to that?
I really like the food analogy because I tend to make food analogies kind of by default when I make analogies. And so this is helpful. I think, right, that if we've got the cheeseburgers on the one hand, I don't know that like a sort of standard filet mignon is like the other extreme, right? I think the other extreme is these sorts of weird. What's that?
Nothing.
I think the other extreme is like the sort of weird, like 3 Michelin star, like the menu, like creepy restaurant, like with strange art done by some sort of goofy post-Christian Italian artist, right? You're like, I don't know that I should be in here. Is this like an occult witch place or a restaurant? I'm not sure, right? Because that looks like an alchemy text from 1317. And I'm scared. Right? I think that's the other extreme. You get into like the weird molecular gastronomy stuff where it's like, this is not a pepper, actually it is cake. And like you like wouldn't appreciate that because you're too poor. Like I think that's the other extreme. And I don't like that either. Like I think you can be too folded up into the 7th dimension, right? For most readers, right? And I don't think that like Guy Kay, for example, is. I think that Guy Kay is elevated but accessible. I think I want to be elevated but accessible. I want to be serving like good quality, like normal food. I don't want to do weird stuff and scare people away. It's like, oh, I made this sushi in the shape of a human hand. I'm like, too creepy. Thank you. Bye. Right. Like, but you see this problem in the culinary world, right? Where like there's a trend of sort of almost reactionary chefs who are like, why did we stop making like classic ordinary food? Right. We can elevate that and we can like apply maybe like new techniques to it. Right. I was watching a video about like a Japanese chef who got really into French cuisine. And he applied his sort of Japanese skills, right, which is a different sort of culinary skill set, right, to French cuisine, right, and sort of elevated it in that sense. But he wasn't sort of making the food unrecognizable, right? It was like maybe a little bit different.
Yeah, there's a Mexican sushi place down the street that I haven't tried yet. It looks incredible. I'm a little like, oh my, I don't know if that's going to taste. I don't know if that's going to react well with my palate, but I'm excited to try it.
Yeah, there are ways to innovate and there are ways to elevate that don't alienate. That was a lot of. I didn't mean for that to rhyme, but in any case, because you don't want to like, especially if you're trying to make a career of this, like you can't be so bizarre that that you can't find an audience, right? And there is such a thing, right? But at the same time, like I don't want to be just slinging cheeseburgers. Like there's nothing wrong with a cheeseburger, but that's not my dream. That's not the restaurant I want to open, right? And so I think there is, as you sort of preloaded here, room for everything, because there are people who like to eat even that weird stuff in the scary restaurant that I don't want to go to, right? There are people who want to go there. But I think science fiction and fantasy in particular are in a weird place, because if you look at the history of the genre in decades past, there's almost always like one thing that's happening, right? In the 60s, it's the new wave. In the 40s into the 50s, it's Campbell, right? And then you get into 80s in science fiction, there's like the big space opera sort of renaissance going into the 90s. And then around the aughts, things get a little bit harder. Right. Now it's not clear to me that that's true. I think the Tower of Babel has fallen, and I think that there are about 100 different little science fictions all going in their own way, and I think they all have their sort of commensurate communities and attention and publishing apparatuses. And so I think now more than ever, if you want a specific thing, you can find that thing. I think the trade-off there is that we lose a sense of cultural unity, right, in the field. And like that's sad because I have friends who are old school like capital F fans who remember.
Sounds like you're talking about the fragmentation of media almost. It's a
Yeah,
very
well,
similar conversation.
it's as above so below, right? As this has happened at sort of a higher cultural level, it's happened down in science fiction land. I think that people who like X have gone over here and people who like Y have gone over here and never the twain shall meet, with exceptions. But I think from a reader's perspective, there's never been a better time, because you can find what you love and only what you love in nearly infinite supply. But from that sort of unified cultural perspective, I think we've lost something, right? I think the Italian Renaissance, for example, has left an impression on our cultural memory because it was one thing, right? Or at least, that's an oversimplification, but there was like an aesthetic, right? And I think the same thing is true with science fiction in the 60s. Like there was a thing going on that really typified, if not universally characterized, the period. I think if you ask people in 100 years what science fiction of the 20s looked like, these 20s looked like, they might not have an answer. I think they might have several.
But whereas I would actually come with just your last point there highlighted where I would kind of disagree with this. One of the reasons we look at the 40s and 50s and go this, and we look at the 60s and go this, is because we're standing 80 years later and going, what has survived? What was the thing still talked about? What was the thing that dominated it? And we don't know what has dominated this time period yet because we don't know the ramifications yet. So when we're in the time period, that's where it can be really difficult to get that sort of external perspective, the view on it, because we see the complications, the fractures, the different groups, the everything moving around. We see that chaos. But once you're external to that, that's where you start perceiving homogeneity. That's where you perceive this, oh, look at that. It's all that one movement that was doing this thing. And it's, again, as you pointed out, an oversimplification of all of these things that we kind of become reductive and overly simplified over time when we look back at it. Because when we look back at the early 20th century and we look at the pulps, you go, oh yeah, it was the pulp movement. But you had science fiction, scientific fiction, weird fiction, horror fantasy hybrids, horror science fiction hybrids. That there wasn't the same, in a lot of respects, the neat divisions that we try to impose now and the subgenrifications that we try to impose now. And there was almost a fluidity to that. When we look at some of the texts that you see in Appendix N in D&D, and you go, oh, well, that's actually a far future world where magic exists because it's science fantasy. And yet now when people point to that happening in a series, it's like, oh, well, they're doing something different. They're doing science. Science fantasy has been around since the 20s. Like it's not new. The Barsoom novels. Oh, he sort of magically, mystically, scientifically teleports from Earth to Mars. They are Martians, so they're aliens. So this is science fiction, but it's all very much the fantastical hero's journey and these strange things. Like how do we define the Barsoom stories? And some of it's more science fictional than others. I think the various movements and aspects of what fantasy can do, we get very developed and very invested in the little niches that we occupy. Like I spent a lot of time looking at epic fantasy, heroic fantasy, high fantasy. And again, a lot of these definitions of these subgenres overlap massively. And, that was an area that I researched very, very heavily. But I don't think that that's the fantasy genre, because you still have urban fantasy, paranormal romance, fan or romantasy. You have singular adventure stories. You have dark fantasy. Any type of fantasy that you can think of, fairy tale, folk tale, the crossovers of all of those different elements. That's still been going from forever to now. And if you're part of those fandoms, if you're part of that particular area of appreciation of what fantasy is, you go, yeah, but it's thriving. We have all of these different authors. And, part of it is we don't have time to do that overview of the whole genre. Like, we don't have the time. We don't have the ability. We can't read everything. There are tens of thousands of works being published every year. But with the food analogy, I completely agree with Christopher here that it's not the difference between burger and filet mignon, because it's not a binary. It's not one or the other. Because even if we just said, okay, all fantasy is burgers, but you have the difference between the burger from the really weird, creepy van that parks at the end of the sports stadium, and you're going, what meat is that? Yes, it's meat. All the way to some gourmet gastropub that has deconstructed the burger and used some sort of space-age laser to gently croutonize the bap, whatever. So even within that, you have this massive range of what burgers can be. And you apply that to what literature and narrative are. You go, science fiction and fantasy, as big as they are, as popular as they are, as how much we are invested in them, are tiny niches compared to the rest of literature. And I think they have an outsized impact on what other narratives and literature are doing. But in terms of readership, in terms of their size, with the occasional outlier, fantasy and science fiction are actually still very, very small. And if there's room in romance for really fascinating, in-depth, psychological, romantic stories investigating the complexities of different human relationships, all the way down to a bodice ripper, there is room within fantasy for your stereotypical archetype going on a plot coupon collecting quest to kill the evil Dark Lord. You can still have that. It can still be fun. It can still be done well. They can employ interesting things in it to make it entertaining or innovative or arresting or immersing. All the way up to highly experimental. And it's, again, I come down to what an author is trying to do. Is the author trying to be as commercial as possible? In which case, you're aiming PG-13. That's what you're doing in literary terms. You're aiming at a reading ability, level of literacy, level of engagement, and quite often psychological awareness of a PG-13 area. And that's where you start if you're going to be writing commercially. And because of its popularity, sometimes that can dominate our view of what the genre is doing. You go, but the genre is never just the bestsellers. The genre is not even the most recognizable of the books within the genre. The genre is so much bigger and encapsulates so much more that all genres rise and fall in popularity. They all have their time in the sun, and some last longer than others. And this too shall pass. What I'm doing is I just want to enjoy the sheer variety of stuff that is being produced, seeing new voices tell stories in new ways, highlight different aspects of things. That is an aspect of today's publishing that, because of independent and self-publishing, giving access for authors to tell unique stories that the increasingly limited number of publishing outlets are available for, to reach an audience, to find an audience, so that those books that you were growing up and you went, it's good, but it's not quite right. Suddenly we are finding the things that hit every single note that we love. And publishing today is fraught and difficult and highly competitive. There are all these different demands for people's attention, but at the same time, it is wonderful to see how many different voices are finally getting their stories out there, and the chance for an audience to find them and engage with them and love them.
So to your earlier point, I'm tempted to agree with most of that, but I'm also I'm somewhere in between what you and Christopher said on that one, because I do think that you're right, AP, that we do have this tendency of reductive historicism, looking back and feeling the need, and we probably do have the need to simplify our life and make sense of the world and history, to engage in, to neatly periodize history in a reductive fashion that's not always accurate and is a kind of hindsight blindness. But I also think about the fact that it does feel like when I go back and read those weird tales, stories, and when I go back to read Astounding magazine, and a couple of years ago, I went back and read Campbell's Who Goes There, which of course later becomes the film The Thing. And there are, I think you would probably agree with this, AP, there are conventions and trends that even if there is a greater diversity than we look back and think there is, and even if things are more complex in the moment, I couldn't believe how dialogue heavy the stories were back then in these pulp magazines. It's almost all dialogue. And I said, this is almost unreadable. I couldn't believe how much I disliked the actual story, Who Goes There. I'm such a big fan of the film.
That's interesting.
And I do think that there is an Italian Renaissance aesthetic, even if the question is more complicated. For example, even in the 20th century, Christopher, you mentioned the shift from what we call the pulp era to the what do they call it? The Campbellian era with L. Ron Hubbard and Heinlein and Campbell, the Golden Age, as they call it.
Sure.
And then that shifts into the New Wave. And I do think there is an aesthetic, or at least a set of intellectual preoccupations that dominate the New Wave. You could say, as Michael D.C. Drought does of Wheaton College, that you get the turn away from outer space to inner space, and you do see that with those New Wave writers. So I think I'm just adding to what you're saying, AP, not refuting it at all. What do you guys think about that?
Well, if I can sort of defend my point a little bit, I think you're right. I think that there's always an internal complexity to any period of literature, right, or of culture generally. But I think I do think that now is a little bit special because the amount of material being produced is orders of magnitude larger than at any other point in history. So I do wonder if in 100 years things might be a little bit more, I don't know, maybe a little more complicated in terms of the historiography of the genre in this period. Obviously, that's purely speculative. It's possible that we've undergone some kind of sea change, right?
Purely speculative from you, but you're a speculative author.
Right.
That's exactly what we expect.
That's all I can do, right? It's my only trick. So I don't know, right? I have the sense though, just because I've watched this sort of disintegration of fandom in the last generation, over the last decade in particular. I have a friend who has been to every Worldcon since Campbell's last one. So that was, I think, 71 or 73. I'm bad at remembering numbers. And when he was a kid, it was possible to read basically everything. Because the quantity of what was being produced was so much lower. I worked with a guy who could tell you what the cover story was in analog for basically any month from like 1950 to like 1985, right? Just sort of kind of people that I'm talking about here, right? And that was in a period too where like to know that was sort of to have your finger on kind of the center point of what the genre was. Campbell in particular, right, was so didactic an editor, right, that he wouldn't accept stories that weren't to his vision, which is kind of editor I wouldn't particularly enjoy working with, I think, right? But it has the side effect of creating an aesthetic and an ethic even within the field, and especially when it's something like Astounding or Analog, right? That's such a tentpole for everything. It does have sort of a kind of gravitational locus effect on everything else. So there is stuff that's outside that. I much prefer the earlier stuff. I love the pulp era substantially more than the Golden Age, in large part because these things hadn't ossified. But the other feature here is that as any art form, as any medium matures, the conventions of it ossify. And so people have to think inside these little boxes: grimdark, epic fantasy, heroic fantasy, high fantasy, low fantasy, whatever. And when you have this new generation of writers coming, and they think in those terms and in those boxes, and so we don't have the same sort of invention and play that we have in the earlier period, which is why I like that earlier stuff. But I think too that this ossification has had contributes to this sort of alienation, that mutual alienation that a lot of modern fiction has from one another, right?
So
There are
you're
like
saying
lots
we make labels and then the labels make us. It sounds like kind of what you're
Yeah,
saying.
yeah, basically to riff on that Gene Wolfe quote.
Yeah.
Yeah, I see what you're doing there, Jordan. But I do think that we're in this process is sort of accelerating because of like independent publishing, which I certainly have nothing against. Having done some of it myself, I always worry as a traditionally published author that people think I'm like dunking on the indies, but I think because they're able to produce so much and so specifically, and because it's so algorithm driven, that's really driving the ossification and the insularization of genre from genre, subgenre from subgenre, and I think that that's what I think is causing this sort of babble thing that I'm talking about now. This isn't like a really well expounded theory on my part. This is just a sense that I've had for a long time. But in talking to like one fan versus another, like I don't know what authors they're talking about by and large. Now, partly this is my own ignorance. Like I didn't know Pierce Brown existed until I was compared to him. And he's like way big, right? So like this is my fault for not paying attention sufficiently. But like there is so much that like I could miss Pierce Brown, right? Like that's a strange, like that wouldn't have been true in 1950. You couldn't have missed Asimov, right? I think if you were because I by no means am a casual fan of the genre, right? And so I do wonder if we're not in like new circumstances. But anyway, I just wanted to defend my point there because you were completely right, and I just didn't want to look too stupid. So
no, but you make a brilliant point that the sheer volume of it is one of the things that we are going to have to deal with. But I think in the future, looking back on it, that's where people will actually, because they mightn't talk about fantasy and science fiction the way that we do. They might go, oh well, this is the creation of cozy fantasy, and we go, oh, you're talking about that thing. The same way that we look back at there, I go, there's this thing. This was the rise of science fiction under Hugo Gernsback. Here's Campbellian science fiction. Here's this. We could look at a lot of the new wave stuff and the new weird or the weird coming out of the UK and how that was in some ways an answer or a conversation with some of the American stuff. And these things develop, but at the time it was much more nebulous and much less specific. And from our perspective, we look back and we can pinpoint it, and we invent these terms that the people at the time would have gone, "What are you talking about? Why are you applying that term?" That
reminds me of
that's
romanticism. Totally. Like that term for describing the Romantic poets was itself coined in the Victorian period. Looking back, because the Victorians were saying, "Isn't this romantic and sentimental and stuff like that?" So I do get your point.
No, that's totally fair. I don't disagree on that point at all. I just I guess what I'm saying is I think it might be a different challenge to try and pin down now than it would have been to pin down like when Campbell was running Astounding. I think that's
maybe that's an interesting point, because I wouldn't really know from my vantage here whether or not to call it the cozy fantasy period or the grimdark period. I don't know that there's so much one zeitgeist as many zeitgeists.
Well, I wonder if this isn't related to, I have this sense that like one of the metrics for evaluating greatness, right, is popularity over time. I think that staying power is a good filter for determining what good literature is in kind of an atheoretical way, right? I think that clearly Lord of the Rings is great because it's like one of the 10 best-selling books of all time. Or what are we at now? Like 80 years later, that's not true of other books. Now, that's not maybe fair to books that are also great that just aren't super widely read anymore, right? But I think it is at least one form of positive proof for certain books, because there are books that like hit really big and then disappear, right? People don't talk about this is a very lowbrow example, but like they don't talk about Twilight the way that they like did 10 years ago, right? Like it's kind of mostly dropped off. Harry Potter's still around in a way that Twilight isn't, right? And maybe that's a testament to the skill there. Maybe that's only a testament to the skill of the marketer.
Wow, you went with Twilight. I was thinking like D.H. Lawrence, and you went with Twilight.
No, I was. Look, we did. Look, I guess I'm trying to make fancy cheeseburgers, so I'm thinking in cheeseburger terms. So.
Well, 50 Shades of Grey. There are certain novels or series that, for whatever reason, strike a spark and spread everywhere, and they become incredibly popular. There are others, Lord of the Rings, for example. How much of that was due to what Ballantyne did? And then because of the impact it had on D&D, and then how D&D perpetrated that in both their tabletop and in the role-playing games, but also then in the computer game variants, and how computer games came to dominate the landscape that would keep going back to Tolkien. One of the things that we find when we talk to readers who have never read The Lord of the Rings up until now, they've seen the Peter Jackson movies, they may have played computer games, they may have played all these, and they go back and they try to read The Fellowship of the Ring, and they go, what is this? So the impact of Tolkien is absolutely enormous on the field. But is it great literature? Well, it's widely known, was highly influential. But is it great literature? And then that's where we get into this whole, what are our criteria? How are we evaluating this? Because we start talking about, it's over time. Then we can't call anything great literature unless it's been around for 100 years, in which case Tolkien still has to wait 20. Because, we need to see how things play out. And for me, Tolkien is incredibly important, but popularity is such an ephemeral sort of concept that is affected by so many other considerations. How it was marketed, the time in which it was marketed, whether or not it just caught the right wave, the stars aligned. And we look at Harry Potter. What sets Harry Potter apart from, say, the Worst Witch series or the Just William series, a different set of school days novels? What sets it apart? What made it so much more different than a whole load of other young kid goes to boarding school to learn magic? But for whatever reason, it caught the right wave at the right time. And even then, it wasn't with book 1, and it wasn't with book 2. It was book 3 that saw the launch of the Harry Potter phenomenon. Book 3. So do we say, well, books 1 and 2, they're not great because they didn't have that. But book 3, that was the one that created the phenomenon. And, popularity, that's why I'm always wary about popularity being used as a metric. But I love The Lord of the Rings, 19th century prose romance melded with Anglo-Saxon epic, set in a secondary world to create this mythological layer that was separate from reality. He was doing so much that was amazing. But for a lot of modern readers, due to how they've been educated, the type of text that they read, the type of text that they encounter, how they are trained to understand narrative, they see The Lord of the Rings, they see the Fellowship of the Ring, and they go, well, who would design a quest party this way? Why do we spend so much time in the Shire? Who's Tom Bombadil?
Why are they walking so much? Well, I teach this book at my school, and my students, many of them, if they've signed up for my course, they're a non-representative sample of Gen Zers. Most of them have seen the Peter Jackson movies, and I have them read The Hobbit over the summer, and then they read Fellowship of the Ring. That's the first book we read as a class. And Christopher and I, and presumably you, can all agree that it's great. It's truly great literature. But as you say, when my students open it up, they're like, this is so slow, because their brains are rewired to expect the grandeur. There's almost a grimdark quality to the way that Peter Jackson makes those films as well, that they're expecting that they don't get. There's a real darkness, and even to the cinematography and stuff like that. And so they read this book, and the characters are just walking, and then they meet Tom Bombadil, and they're like, "What is this?" Right? As AP was talking, I was thinking, "Oh my gosh," because AP was talking about how there are these interesting reasons for why books get carried forward and transmitted to the next generation. Man, to Christopher's utter horror, the hippie movement is one of the things that brought Lord of the Rings, that increased the popularity of Lord of the Rings, and William Blake, I might add, and just to Christopher's utter horror that was part of its story.
Well, no, God moves in mysterious ways. I was talking to Betsy Wolheim last week about her father's role in all of this, right? Publishing that unauthorized edition. Very briefly, this was not the whole of the conversation, so I wasn't in any real depth, but it is you never know, right? That like this sort of hyper conservative Oxford Don literary snob would catch on with hippies because an atheist of Jewish descent, right, published a unauthorized version in paperback in the United States, right? Like who knows, right? Like I totally. I don't mean to diminish it to popularity. I think there is an anti-fragility though, that sort of tends to render things important because they've survived, right? There's a lot of like we have what is it 7 or 8 Sophocles plays? He wrote something like 130. Like we
Yes.
might have the bad ones, right? But they are good because they are important, right? In part, right? Now again, this is like a really to really get at the greatness question in like a definitive, scientific way. We have to do this, intensely multivariate analysis, right? And like we probably can't actually adequately answer the question. And so determining greatness is something I think we can only kind of approach asymptotically, right? Like we have enough evidence that this book is good, right, from a textual analysis standpoint, and enough evidence that it's important historically, and enough evidence that like people like it. Maybe only need 2 of those. I don't know, right? That we can confidently say you should probably like read Sophocles, right? But it's not like it's not math, right? It's not 2 and 2 is 4, and it's always 4 unless O'Brien tells you otherwise, right? It's a lot more organic, right? This is why I am not in the STEM fields, because I'm, I guess, more comfortable with not having a definitive answer to things, to the frustration I think of my readers. Yeah. Anyway, I think that. I don't know. I'm not troubled. Sometimes a greatness just seems obvious to me. Which is separate from like I like it. Like I know when I like something that's bad. But I also know when something is great and I hate it.
Me too, man. I'm a sucker for John Grisham novels, and boy, is he a bad writer. But I just can't help it, man. I just eat that stuff up. Right.
Occasionally, like you'll accidentally eat a whole Domino's pizza, and that's not even pizza. Right. As an Italian, I'm obliged to say that, right?
Oh, we can't get away from this this food metaphor. I want to change gears here, and I want to get kind of hyper specific now. And this question is based off of something that I learned from AP through Philip Chase. I wanted to ask you guys about an aspect of writing that I think is really important. I asked Philip Chase about this because I'd heard him talking about this very thing in a video that he made. I think it was about Joe Abercrombie, and I thought he might know. This is about 1.5 years, maybe 2 years ago, where I sent him an email and asked about this quality or ability that some writers have to write in the third person in a way that makes it still feel like you're in the character's head. Just the way that good writers can deliver the narration, not in a neutral way, but in a way that feels bent towards the inner subjective experience of each of the characters. And so then Philip got back to me when I asked him about this, and he said that he'd always thought of it as the POV character's voice bleeding into the third person limited omniscient narrator's voice. And then he emailed me back and he said that you, AP, call it internal focalization. And I'm telling you, I see this as one of the most important techniques. I don't know if you'd call it a tool or a device or whatever, but to me, this is one of the dividing lines. We've been talking about literary greatness between sort of really average fiction and really great fiction, this internal focalization and the ability to do it with different characters and then make their sort of inner qualia different. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that, AP, how you feel that works, how good authors do it, what it can do for a story, and how it helps readers to connect with a story. And then I might ask afterwards Christopher to tell us how he does it, because Christopher does it well.
Well, for a start, I wasn't the one that came up with the term. It was Jared Jeanette.
Oh.
So he's one of the big narratologists, and he was detailing all of this because if you have, let's say you've selected a point of view, and your character is an incredibly wealthy billionaire, and they walk into a standard hotel, like one of the hotel, an airport hotel. But they're a billionaire. They live in this fabulous mansion. For whatever reason, they've had to go into this hotel. So their perception of it is going to be, well, that's a pretty dingy carpet and the fixtures aren't particularly, and that looks cheap and that's nasty. So how they would describe that scene is going to be framed through their subjectivity. So if you were recreating the description and you're laying out in your third person point of view, but you're not going in behind their eyes, you're just describing it. You flavor the text with how that character would describe it. Now, imagine on the same shuttle from the airport, someone who was very, very poor, and this was their first holiday ever that they had scrimped and they had saved and they had done all of this, and they walk in and they're like, oh my God, this floor is like marble. This is so beautiful. They're in exactly the same place at exactly the same moment in time, but how they perceive it can be radically different to the person sitting next to them. So one of the ways that this can be incredibly useful, and Abercrombie is great with this point of view control, laying out, and I think he's talked about his processes that like he writes out what happens and then he goes back through and he does a pass going, how would this character describe these things? Is Glotka going to notice when he walks into a room if there are stairs out of the room? Yes, Glotka's going to notice that, but would someone else notice that? No, it's not relevant to them. But Glotka's going to notice because he hates writing about stairs or trying to walk up and down stairs. So it's a very important facet of information about that room to him. But Logan mightn't even notice that. But he might notice the two giant swords that are within easy reach on the wall because that's important to him. So even what the person sees, how they describe it, how you transfer that information, thinking about how a character would perceive it can allow you to take your very straightforward, let me lay out the scene for you. But it helps an author select what aspects of that scene to select, how to describe them, what words to use. And then as a reader, if this is how the chapter is done, you get a feeling for the interiority of that character. Even if there's no internal monologue, even if there's no little italics going, I thought angrily, that you feel this character because you're inhabiting their perspective of the world. And that's focalization and the different ways that you can focalize your narrative is a wonderful technique, but it's not necessary in all cases, because if you want that more detached view, if you want that more neutral view of things, then focalization is entirely the wrong way to go, because again, it's about the narrative that the author is telling. Not that you need this technique in order to be good. It is an incredibly useful tool in the author's toolkit. And the more tools an author has access to, the more command they have over all of these different techniques, the more we see that they use really appropriate techniques for that specific moment to create and achieve that specific effect. That is great writing, knowing which technique to use, how to use it, when to deploy it, and when not to deploy it. Like those are all aspects of great writing. So it's not that focalization is the be all and end all, but it's one that is easy to point out to people. Why do Sansa's chapters read differently to say Jon's chapters? Because Jon has a different voice. I know, but it's the narrator still telling you the story. Yeah, but Jon's chapters maybe should feel different. He will focus on different things. So that gives you that way to differentiate them. And, it was, an actual narratologist who's written actual books came up with all of this stuff. I just, like all academics go, that was a brilliant idea. I like that term. That's what I want to talk about.
Yeah, and Christopher, I agree. George R. R. Martin is a master of that in the fantasy genre.
He's very good at it.
He may be the best in fantasy, but Christopher, you're very good at this too. How do you do this? Is there a particular technique or approach that you take? Is it something that you do just automatically, or is it something that you're conscious of and you're trying to do that? Or is it just that, you know, well, you write in the first person, at least in the main Sun Eater series, so maybe this technique just comes with the first person POV territory? But how do you do it? Because that's one of the reasons I like your books so much.
Yeah, so I think the first person clarifies it to a certain extent, because it's more concrete, right? Like, suddenly I am not Christopher, right, writing about Hadrian. I am Hadrian, right? Like, in a more concrete psychological way in the actual writing. And so yeah, so I think the first person helps. Obviously, I've written some third person as well. And I don't know that I was super conscious of a difference with regard to that, but I think that maybe the first person accentuates this a little bit further. But like I said, I've been deeply moved by Gene Wolfe, right? Just as a professional, right? Because this is something Gene Wolfe does so very well, right? There's a short story I've talked about before. He did called Trip Trap, and Trip Trap is about basically a Starfleet officer and a medieval knight who is an alien, right? And their shared experience fighting a troll that lives under a bridge that is another kind of alien. And it's written from both of their perspectives, right? And their interpretation of what is going on is very, very different, right? And the short story will sort of, go back and forth and sort of cut, back and forth between them as well. And so you get different perspectives, and also that the troll like messes with their perceptions in a way. So it's all about that, right? But stories are about people, right? People have to do things. Like, I'm not saying that you can't be like a plot first kind of writer, but it's still about the people doing things, right? Even if we're not getting into their head. And you, as a writer, right, you have to choose. Even before you decide if you're going to write prose, you have to choose if you're writing a comic book or something, right? You have to choose the medium, right? But then you have to choose how you're going to use the medium, and the medium informs, it informs the message. I'll riff on McLuhan here, right? Like, because you can tell stories in certain ways in certain media, right? And you can't tell them in other ways, and so you have to make these decisions. And point of view is sort of the next step after that, right? You choose, how am I going to use this medium, right? You can make the decision sort of a priori if you want, right? Like, I'm going to write third person omniscient because, like, that's what I'm feeling, right? And then you can get into a story and realize that was the wrong choice, right? Or you can realize that choice changes the nature of the story in a certain way. But so you can make that choice first, or you can then have an idea for how the story works and ask yourself, how do I tell the story that I have? Oh, it's clearly first person, or it needs to be sort of multifocalized third person, right? George Martin style, or whatever. You make your decisions based on the kind of story. If you have the idea for the kind of story first, you can work backwards or forwards, right? But I'm very conscious of the fact, regardless of what perspective that I'm writing, that it's still me telling the story, right? Like, I'm not one of those writers who like have some sort of weird transported out of body experience, right? Who's like, oh, it's the muses, bro. Like, that's like, they aren't real. Sorry, bro. Calliope is fake. But so I'm not that guy, right? Like, I'm actually like pretty afantastic. Like, I can't picture things very clearly in my head at all, right? So like, everything is like a very conscious engagement with the language for me, right? I read everything out loud. I'm constantly like reading back and mumbling under my breath, and and sort of thinking about the text as text. And because of that, right, I have to very consciously think about the kinds of decisions that AP is talking about, right? Like, how does Hadrian see the room that he's in, right, as Hadrian, right? Now, if I were maybe less conscious in making these decisions and sort of feeling things out, I might have a harder time with that. But because my brain does not let me see pictures very clearly, I think I have to think about this a little bit more directly. I know a writer who and like, I don't know if he was like on something or not when he was telling me this, frankly, from the way he was describing it. He was like, no, I actually like feel pain. Like, when I write my character going through pain, I'm like, I don't know how to relate to that.
Should maybe see a doctor.
That sounds fake. But I digress. But in those cases, maybe it's not as obvious, like, what you're doing or why you're doing what you're doing, if you're a writer that doesn't have the same thought processes, and like, who does, right? But I think because I have to think about things, I guess more abstractly. I always have the sort of interface between me and the text. You know, I have to think about how is this person talking. So it's maybe a feature of my psychology, or maybe a feature of my like rhetorical grounding, because my my degree is in rhetoric, because as I say all the time, I hate money. And uh, and, and so the questions of like how am I going to structure the prose are things that I think about often before I go in. You know, I have a short story I need to write later this month, and I'm trying. It's Hadrian, but I'm like toying with doing third person just because I haven't, right? And sometimes the decisions can be like that arbitrary. You just be like, well, you see this with Conan Doyle, right? He's like, I'm going to this story is going to be from Sherlock's point of view. It's not Watson this time, right? I'm gonna do this one differently. And those are perfectly like licit and valid reasons. But as far as techniques within that, right? Um, I have a sort of problem in that most of the prose that I've ever written has been from one character's point of view. So I don't know how much of his voice is my voice, right? And vice versa, right? So I have this constant fear when I do anything different that I have just made this other character sound like Hadrian, and that I will inescapably sound like Hadrian for the rest of my life. And so I don't really know, right? Because I've just had so much practice. I've written more than 1 million words in this one voice, right? And so that is a difficulty. But AP already said most of the stuff, right? You think about how does this character see a room, right? What in it, what is like valent to that character, right? Because you don't see the objective world, right? You see through your senses, right? And your senses are like stupid. Your eyes like are actually seeing everything upside down, right? Like everything's super blinkered and sort of fuzzy and subjective, and maybe your eyes don't work at all, right? You could have a character who can't see at all, so you have to like keep that in mind. They actually couldn't see that guy was nodding. You goofed up. We need to change that. And you can often like just have a little, a gimmick right with a character. I think about this a lot in almost like Homeric terms. Homer refers to characters with these epithets because the Iliad was recited, right? And so you need these epithets as mnemonic devices, right? But in writing, you need mnemonic devices as the writer because you don't want to be checking your outline, assuming it exists all the time anyway. So you need to have a touchstone for a character that lets you interface with them. Now, in the case of so I haven't read Joe Abercrombie, but my understanding is Glocta is like some sort of problem with his legs, right? And so like the fact that stairs are a problem, right, is a problem, right? Tyrion like hates riding horses, right? Because he's a dwarf. And if you give, I'm not saying you like should give all of your characters a disability, right? But like maybe like there's a food that they hate, or they hate a color, right? It's like orange again. I hate orange. Like, why would they paint the room this way, right? Something silly like that, but like something that's common enough that it makes the character distinctive, right? You can do this too with dialogue patterns, but this is sort of that's sort of separate consideration. You can you have a character speak in a specific way so that the readers know that it's that character, even if you don't say who's speaking with the speaker tag, right? And that helps you as the writer interface with that character, right? You need to give them a thing, right? It's not necessarily a tick in the like medical sense of the term, but they need something for you to sort of remember you're writing this person and not that person on a sentence by sentence basis.
And you even have with dialogue, you can go, this person's really well educated, so I'm going to give them a higher level of diction, and I'll maybe use slightly more antiquated terminology for their dialogue because it'll sound more formal. And if it sounds more formal, then that gets across that aspect of that character. But with someone else, you might go, oh, but I want to give them, let's say they use short, sharp Anglo-Saxon words a lot. That they're much gruffer, they're more earthy. They will color the air blue. And again, that's something that can be worked in. And even having them bite back on saying something at an inopportune moment or when it would be impolite, which it's so telling about character. And it's using not just what the character sees and what they privilege in that information, not just what they say, but how they say it, how they move through the world, the actions they take, the actions they don't take, where someone insults them and they don't immediately punch them in the face. That tells you something about character. And so these are all different techniques. And it's why not there is no one silver bullet. This is what great writing is, because something written for 8-year-olds, it will have to do something different to something written for 12-year-olds, something for 16-year-olds, something for an adult audience. Depending on your audience, you're going to employ different techniques. Depending on your genre, depending on what books influenced you, what has inspired you, what things you want to avoid doing because you saw someone else do it and you go, you know what, that really doesn't work out well. I want to avoid doing that. So, but that's made me think of this thing. We're always in conversation with all of the narratives we've ever interacted with. They constantly influence us in our perception of things, in our evaluation of things. Think of the first time that you read a story that had a dragon in it, you're like, oh my God, a dragon, this is so cool. How did this person think this up? And then someone goes, stories about dragons have been around for a while. Like, cool your jets there, son. But it's the first time we saw it. And that can leave an impression on us. And then, like, how fallible our memories are. You remember the sequence where these two people were fighting and you go, that was such an emotional, brilliant battle sequence. You look it up and it's like 3 sentences. Why did I think it was emotional? Because the build up to it was emotional. And that release in that moment of those 3 sentences, you know, with a flash, he decapitated him. You're like, oh. But like on its own, you go, that's a boring sentence. But because it had 4 or 5 chapters building up to that moment, that release of tension is what gives it the impact. And this is why it's not ever one element of narrative. It's how they are built together. And you know, that's the difficulty in trying to explain it. Because you're right, I can't sit here for 9 hours to take you through each and everything all in turn. Because then I would have to go back to the start and then do it again, now with a different point. That what we do is we break it up and we go, I'm going to talk about this one little tiny bit, with the understanding that this is one little tiny bit that connects to a whole load of other things that I will get to at some point in the future. And you talk about that one thing, and it is so wonderfully complex that I will never stop learning. Like I don't get to a point and go, you know what, AP, I now know everything that I need to know about narrative. You're like, nothing. There's this vast gulf of stuff I don't know. And I know that I don't know it. So I'm excited to see new techniques, to read new authors, to see people go, oh, well, that's a trope. Yeah, congratulations, you have identified one of the building blocks of writing. How is it being used? Oh, well, it's just a bad trope. Yeah, but how is it being used? Well, it's a bad trope. Okay, you can keep repeating the same words over and over again. It isn't getting too high. Look at Star Wars: A New Hope. We love Star Wars: A New Hope. You know, unless of course you'd watched a whole load of westerns and then you went in to see it and went, why am I just watching this western where everyone's like kind of space age? Or, you know, if you were very familiar with Campbell's The Hero's Journey, you might go in and be disappointed because it was so predictable. And yet the visual of it and how it communicated us or transported us and communicated this world to us, you know, it was fascinating. It was wonderful. But you try to do it in this day and age, and you repeat exactly what Star Wars was, people go, yeah, but I've seen it. And that's boring. You think of the J.J. Abrams Star Wars sequel, and you go, I liked it the first time I saw it when it was called A New Hope. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't really impressive visuals. It doesn't mean that there weren't scenes that you sort of go, oh, that was a really cool scene. But so much of it was reminiscent of Star Wars: A New Hope. You go, but I've already seen this. Even though clearly you haven't. It was new. You can't quantify those elements. You can't quantify and go, well, this percentage of it, as long as you have 12% unique. 12% unique, that's the magic number for this. You're like that. And I think part of today's society, with our obsession with a simple and easy commodification of ratings, oh, it's out of 5. You're like, whoa, that allows for a lot of nuance. And even so, well, I mark mine out of 10. And you go, that's just basically taking a scale of 5 and multiplying by 50. Why not mark out of 100? That you're taking a scale of 5 and multiplying by 20. Like, you can do this with numbers. Mathematics is wonderful, but it's still not getting to the essence of engaging with the complexity of what narrative is.
Yeah. So thank you. It was great. One last question for you guys. I want to wrap it up soon. But this is a selfish question because I selfishly want to know the answer to this question for the sake of my own writing. And so I'm going to ask two experts here. Christopher, I consider you a very philosophical science fiction writer. One of the things that's always boggled my mind since I started reading you is we call all of these other fantasy and sci-fi authors philosophical fantasy or sci-fi, someone like R. Scott Baker. And then when I sat down and read Empire of Silence and then Howling Dark and made my way through your series, these are deeply philosophical books. And as we were saying before, you'll also have a lot of readers, Christopher, who basically just like the whiz-bang sort of romantic action aspect of it as well, which is great that you have all of those things in it. But so most people who follow this channel know this. I finished my manuscript for my fantasy novel and we sent it to one agent. And my thought was, this thing probably sucks and I don't want to burn lots of bridges. So I'm going to send it to one agent who I think might like it. And he got back to us and he asked for the full manuscript and then got back to us with all of his feedback. And he told one of the comments he made was, he said the philosophy in this book, because I was a philosophy major, so I'm really interested in those big ideas and exploring them. Political philosophy, epistemology, metaphysics, all of that, logic. He said the philosophical ideas were fascinating, but heavy-handed. And I thought to myself, well, I want to be a philosophical fantasy writer. But clearly when he read it, and I respect this guy immensely, and he's asked us to submit it again, so we're going to do that soon. But I want it to be a novelist of big ideas, but I don't want it to be heavy-handed or clunky or awkward or too much. How do you do that, Christopher? You're a novelist of big ideas, and yet you do this elegantly without shoving it in our faces or without it being too much exposition or without having the dialogue be phony. How do you pull that off and how do you approach that? Because I know you have a lot of big ideas as well, and they're in there, but I'm not quite sure how you do it.
Well, that's very kind of you to say, for starters. Second, I did not get a full manuscript request on my first agent submission. So actually, maybe you're the master. I don't know. You jerk. It was like 30 something. It took like 6 months before anybody said anything other than no reply.
Christopher, how old are you? You've published like 10 books. How old are you?
I'm 30.
Okay, so you're the jerk.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's what they tell me. But I think we talked about the answer to this earlier, actually, right? It's that you need to stop being a Gnostic heretic and sort yourself out. The issue, right, is that the drama isn't narrative isn't polemic, right? It's not an essay, right? And so the ideas need to be embodied in people, right? Characters need to. I mean, think about Dostoevsky, right? Like there are so many ideas embodied in Ivan, right? And there are so many ideas embodied in Alyosha, and it is the conflict of those two characters as avatars for those ideas, right, that allows the ideas to be present in the narrative in like an actual, real, embodied human way, right? Because those ideas fighting each other in the marketplace of ideas is like, that's not that interesting, right? It needs to be, the conflict needs to be realized, in humanity, right? In the real world of the story, right? It needs to play out between characters with real tangible consequences. And like maybe somebody gets stabbed, right? Maybe somebody gets lit on fire, right? Because the ideas are animating, right? They possess people, and cause people to do all sorts of crazy things. Sometimes good, sometimes bad, right? But it needs to The ideas need to move the characters, and they can move the characters on the level of the individual, or like, on the level of like a people, right? Like the Extrasolarians clearly represent a bunch of ideas, right? The Empire represents a lot of ideas in my book, right? But then individual people within those bubbles represent either nuances of those ideas or contradictions with those ideas or something, right? But it needs to all be through the lens of like actual people, because stories, like I said, are about those people, right? They're about characters, and if it's not about the character first, especially readers now will fade away. They'll lose interest, right? So yeah, it needs, the characters need to live those ideas, right? And die for them. Probably because fantasy is like, it's never it's never not, at least a little extreme, right? Like something's gonna happen. I mean, I know cozy fantasy is a thing, but not for me. So
AP, how do you approach this question, and what would you tell me? You haven't read it yet, but what would you tell me if you were my editor? How do you engage with that question?
Well, what I would tell you if I was your editor is let me read it first, because there is no advice anyone can give you about what you have written until they have actually read it, because without knowing what you have done and how you were doing it, what you were trying to say, to go, oh, I could see this thing, so we could do it that way. But you could talk about the potential within fantasy and even within science fiction of literalizing metaphor. And that can be incredibly powerful. Or you can talk about, okay, well, if I want to investigate this particular theory, let's make that theory a person. So there's my first step down. They're going to be epitomized by that. But that is going to be too bold and too obvious. So I'm going to split that person into these two people, because that's going to represent that aspect of it. No, I'm going to split it into these people. So how can I represent those people being in conflict with those people? Right. Well, that idea was in conflict with that idea. So this is the basis of this. And you start building it out. And the thing is, you've removed every single overt reference to that philosophy and that argument. You've removed all of it. You don't have a character going, well, I was looking at these shadows being projected on a cave, and you go, no, that's not in it anymore. But you start having.
There's something very close to that in my book as it is, and so you haven't read it yet, but oops.
Or you could do what Brandon Sanderson does and go, oh, I'm going to make this whole world of abstracts because no one came up with that idea 2,000 years ago.
Right.
It's wholly original. But anyway, sorry. But in literalizing it, it gives you a way to play with the idea without it being, as Christopher pointed out, a polemic or a screed or a dire criticism. You're leaving it up to those readers who are interested in looking below the surface to go, oh, this is about the contrast between the conflict between capitalism and communism. I'm seeing that enacted here because this person is obviously a merchant of some kind, and here's someone who's part of the farming community and they've come into conflict. That we start seeing them as symbolically representative of these different aspects. And you can play with that. Or you could do something like Ursula Le Guin, the ones who walk away from Omelas, and go, you know what? No, I'm going to write a story that has no actual characters, that is a thought experiment, that is from, an elaboration of something from Brothers Karamazov, which was a reference to something from, it was from one of the Greek philosophers.
I was thinking utilitarianism in the ones who walk away from Omelas, so I was thinking about John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham, but
it goes all the way back in that.
Yes,
this is but it was, he went, right, well, that's what I want to do, and I want to do it very overtly. Or we're going to have, this person is from an anarchic sort of communist utopian agricultural society, and then they're going to arrive in a hyper-capitalist world. Let's see what happens. You can be obvious about it and lean into that and play with it. You can be subtle about it. You can be abstract about it. But it ultimately comes down to, well, what is the story that you are telling? Who are you telling this story to? What do you hope to achieve with it? What are you trying to communicate? What effect do you want to have on your reader? What do you want them to feel? And those are all, on the one hand, they can seem like tree-huggy, but those aren't proper questions. But to get deep down into what you're trying to do, if the more of a handle you have on that as an artist, the quite often the more focused you can be in how you're achieving it. And then you're also aware of what your goals are versus, say, what an agent's goals are. The agent might be looking at it going, well, this book is great, but can you dial that back because I want to do more commercial, because I want to try and hit this audience that likes this sort of thing. Can you make it more? That's not necessarily what you are trying to do. And it will be brilliant advice for that thing. But that's why choosing your editor, choosing your agent, how you try to place your book, these are things that require thought. And finding the person who works well with you, who fits with what you are trying to do, is sympathetic to that. And so it's a supportive relationship rather than, I keep trying to do this thing and he keeps trying to move me that way. You end up butting heads with people. And, that's not conducive to good storytelling.
Oh, thank you very much. That's very good advice. Yeah, my bad guy is an evil Nietzschean druidic supervillain who gives his daughter's lesson. He's training his daughter to be a druid, and he's giving her, didactic lessons about how to be more Nietzschean like him. And yeah, I think he was right about that. It's funny because all the advice that he gave me, I agreed with. I found myself like, yes, that is true. That is heavy-handed. And now that I'm looking at it, what's that?
But which book of Terry Goodkin's happens where he goes from the new world, he goes into the old world, and it's communist. So he takes libertarian capitalism.
Ayn Rand, right?
But he takes libertarian capitalism to defeat this old empire communist system, and they make a giant, beautiful statue of liberty, which is actually all about capitalism and not paying taxes. But you were looking at that and go, okay, like I get what you're trying to do with this, but it's not a particularly entertaining story, and it's really, really ham-fisted, like a lot of Goodkin's writing. But if that's what he wanted to do.
Well, he was interviewed. He gets interviewed about it. And I know he's passed, sadly, but when he was alive and he was answering interview questions, he was so intense on this that people would interview him and say, "What are some of your literary inspirations?" And he would say Ayn Rand, and they would go, "Okay, well, that's great. Anything else?" And he would go, "No, I only read Ayn Rand ever. That's it." He literally said that. Dude, broaden it out, man. But anyways.
to give you an example of this, okay, so one of the reasons why I think a lot of people react badly against some of what Goodkin did with his political ideology within it was so overt and was dictating what was going to happen in the plot. And we talked earlier about focalization. So if you recall, whether you liked it or loathed it or how you felt about it, in the Wheel of Time TV show, season 1, the pacifists are hiding 2 heroes, and they link arms because they're pacifists. They're never going to raise weapons, and the bad guys, the white cloaks with their swords and weapons, basically attack these pacifists, these non-violent, non-confrontational people who go like, "We'll help anyone we come across. It doesn't matter." We have exactly the same sequence in basically the same sequence happens in Goodkin series, but in it he has Richard is the one with righteous anger killing the pacifists because how dare they treat the wounded of both sides of this conflict, and he needed to torture them for information, and they were like, no, but like, we're neutral, we're not part of this. If anyone's wounded, we treat whoever's here, your soldiers, their soldiers, it doesn't matter, we're not involved. But with righteous fury, he cuts through them. And you're like, you do realize you're making your hero look like a villain because his actions, no matter how often you tell us he did it righteously, he did it with virtue. Yes, he virtually murdered all of these people. No, he virtuously did not do any of that. But that's where the politics of what he was trying to get across led him to something that when you look at it, you bang into it and go, no, but this person is meant to be a hero. Why is he slaughtering unarmed civilians?
Right. You don't want to let your ideology algorithmically program what ends up on the page. And I think that's an important reminder.
But for him, this clearly was important. And because of the lens through which he was looking at the character, he didn't see it as a problem. It's like, well, no, of course, in this situation.
Right.
And when we think back to, part of the time period when this was written, what happened with 9/11 and that feeling of you're either with us or against us. And if you provide any aid or succor to the enemy, you're as bad as the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
That was a very prevalent message that was being broadcast.
Yeah.
So even though to us now, we might look at that and go, right, we have a problem with that. It all depends on the framework, how it's deployed,
Mm-hmm.
and what an author is doing with it, and the ramifications of those things. And that's, again, something I think sets great literature apart. Where when the decisions have ramifications and they are followed through, and there are psychological ramifications as well as the material world ramifications, when that is followed through and communicated, that can be devastating and really hit us in the gut because we see the cost of these decisions.
All right, guys. So I'm going to wrap it up. That was great. Thank you. Just like over 2 hours, 2.5 hours of just I feel edified. So I hope you guys at home do too. Follow Christopher Ruocchio on, I think it's called Sun Eater YouTube.
Yeah. Sun Eater, I think it's Sun Eater Books. I should know
Sun
this.
Eater Books, and AP is at A Critical Dragon. And so follow me on Facebook, Instagram, Goodreads, and Tip Your Starving Booktuber on Patreon. And unless there's anything else, guys, I'm going to say goodbye to you.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. And AP, it was really great to meet you, sir.
It was a pleasure to meet you. Thank you, Jordan, for bringing us all together for this. It was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you so much. I agree. It was fun. All right, guys.